I really would like to concur with and reinforce what Comrade Miloš and Comrade Jeff have both said. I'm in full agreement with both of them. I think it's a good idea to go back to the propaganda we were reading in Western media at the end of 2021 and the beginning of 2022. First of all, when Russia presented its last-ditch attempt for a peaceful resolution and a mutual security agreement, it was ridiculed and dismissed in the West. And then we started to have our newspapers filled with reports that Russia is preparing an invasion. Russia's preparing, and it was every day there was more and more and more of it, and it seemed very strange. And even for someone like me, I've been following the war situation in Ukraine, in Donbass for a long time. I said, why do they keep talking about a Russian invasion? We found out afterwards, didn't we, that in fact this was a pure projection, that the NATO-backed forces, the Ukrainian army, was massing its troops on the border of Donbass to get ready for a full-scale invasion to try to reconquer the liberated territories in the Donbass, Donetsk and Lugansk. And in order to justify this, the Western media was saying, Russia's going to invade, Russia's going to invade, Russia's going to invade. A part of that was also aimed at Russia. They were trying to intimidate Russia to stop Russia intervening on behalf of the Donbass. It didn't work. It didn't work, but it made it, the propaganda, until we were able to look at it afterwards and see what had been underneath it, made it look as if the USA had predicted a Russian invasion which seemed to come out of nowhere. That was how the propaganda narrative was built. But of course, all the factors which triggered the launch of Russia's special military operation were prepared in advance by NATO, by the USA, on Russian soil. What do we see now in South Korea and in China in regards to Taiwan? What do we see in the Western media? We see dehumanizing propaganda of imperialism's enemies. We see lots and lots and lots of war exercises carried out by the imperialists, which they say are necessary because the other side is aggressive. That's what they say all the time. We see encirclement of bases, military bases, hostile military bases around China, around the DPRK. We see the imperialists feverishly building up their military presence in both places, building up their bases, their alliances, trying to stir up trouble, trying to break links between countries. In particular, of course, in the South China Sea, endlessly trying to create provocations and create differences between countries in the area to justify a US presence in a part of the world where there's no actual reason for them to be. And of course, blaming China all the while they're doing it. So in reality, if you look underneath all of that, you can see it is the imperialists who are preparing for a war. And another indication of this, I think, was the personnel change in the State Department. A little while ago, Victoria Nuland, who's been the long-term architect for the USA of the war in Ukraine, was replaced in the State Department. And I forget the name of the guy who they replaced her with, but he was the one who wrote the book for Obama about the pivot to Asia. The pivot to Asia meaning we must focus our efforts as US imperialism on crushing and destroying China by any means necessary. That's the subtext of pivot to Asia. It means while we've been busy in the Middle East, China has been rising and now we must crush it. And this conversation is still going on in the White House and in the Senate, in the corridors of power in the USA, while we've been spending our attention on Ukraine China continues to grow in economic power and diplomatic influence, and we must do something about that. Miloš gave you very clearly the reasons why imperialism is forced to go to war all the time, whether or not it makes logical sense. As a human being, you can stand on the outside and say, well, don't be silly. That doesn't make any sense. Yes, we know that China prefers peaceful reunification and will not itself look for ways to escalate. But China has clearly been preparing for war because it knows very well that it can't rely on the USA to fulfill any agreement, and the USA is constantly escalating. And so first of all, China's preparation is the best deterrence against open warfare. But second of all, of course, they have to be ready to fight the war that might be forced upon them. And clearly they're making those preparations. For all of their talk about, we only want peace, we only want peace, we only want peace, they have understood the message from everything the USA has been doing, and they make their preparations accordingly. We have seen that the USA tries to avoid a direct war. One of the reasons for that, of course, is they would have great difficulty mobilizing their own people to fight their wars abroad. Great difficulty. We saw that already in the Middle East. The numbers of people who defect, desert, or in other ways abscond or try to be conscientious objectors in the US Army is actually massive. They hide it. They don't report it because they don't want it to spread and they don't want it to be generally known. But there are large numbers of deserters and defectors from the US Armed Forces, and they cannot fill the ranks of their professional army. All across Europe now, the various European powers are talking about the need for conscription armies, because their professional armies are declining, dwindling, and they can't even meet the targets they set themselves for the number of recruits they're going to get, never mind expand their armies on this basis. So they have a big problem, and they try to use proxy forces wherever they can. Jeff has explained very well how the Taiwanese are being prepared as a proxy force in the same way that the Ukrainians were prepared. Military training, weapons, given an ideology that to try to make them feel anti-Chinese and pro-Taiwan, although that's a very contradictory thing when you consider that Taiwanese people are Chinese. But nevertheless, you know, it's been very much encouraged, this kind of ideology in Taiwan, just as it was encouraged in Ukraine, just as it has been encouraged, of course, also in South Korea, to view the people in the north as somehow something totally different and alien, and the government up there as something, evil and alien to the south. This is a part of the preparations for using the people of South Korea as a proxy army, and your land as a battlefield in a war to destroy North Korea. That's the aim of the USA. That doesn't mean they're going to succeed, but you can clearly see that those are the aims. They're also preparing their forces in Japan and in Australia to act as proxy armies in this region. And I would just, reinforce what Miloš said about why is it important to explain these things to our people? Why should we be preparing them for the war that will break out, or that could be going to break out in East Asia, that's very likely to be provoked in East Asia? It's because we need them to be mobilized in order to join the forces against imperialism, when and if that happens. We need them to understand the nature of the war, who has really provoked it, as opposed to what the propaganda is going to tell them, and what's the ultimate cause of all this war, which is, as we've been saying here, the economic crisis and the desperate drive to create profitability of the global capitalist